The garden at Pinecrest Manor smelled of wet pine needles and old stone. It had rained that morning in the small town of Silveridge, Vermont, and the gravel paths were still damp. The leaves on the dark green hedges hung heavy, with little drops of water that fell whenever the wind moved through the valley. The sun had come back out, but it was a thin, pale sun that gave light to the mountain slopes, but no real warmth to the earth below. The young woman walked slowly along the path, with her hands held tight together in front of her gray dress. Her name was Hazel Cross, and she was 23 years old. She had lived in this house for 5 years, ever since her father had died and left her with nothing but debts. In exactly 3 weeks, she was supposed to be married to a man she had never met. She walked past the empty flower beds and the small stone fountain that had stopped working 2 winters ago. She went all the way to the back of the grounds, where a tall hedge made a thick green wall against the rest of the world. Behind this hedge, there was a small bench made of pale gray stone, a patch of long grass, and an old apple tree that stayed dark and cool, even in the middle of summer. This was her private place, where nobody else ever came. The old cook, Mary, had told her about it when Hazel first arrived at the manor, looking thin and frightened. Mary had told her that if she ever needed to cry without anyone watching, she should go behind the back hedge. Hazel had not used the place much during her first year because she had been too tired and too busy learning the rules of her aunt's house. Today she sat down on the cold stone bench and felt the dampness soak through the back of her thin fabric. The dress had belonged to her cousin Lydia 2 years ago, and it still smelled faintly of the dried lavender Lydia kept in her drawers. Hazel pressed her cold hands against her face and felt the heat in her cheeks. She did not sob out loud, because she had spent 5 years learning how to keep her voice quiet. Her aunt did not like the sound of crying and often said it gave her a terrible headache. So Hazel had learned to let her tears fall without making a sound, the way a shadow moves across a wall. She stared at the small stones near her shoes and wondered how she would survive the coming month. "I cannot do this," she whispered into the empty air. "I cannot marry him." The man her aunt had chosen for her was Baron Raymond Kent, a wealthy landowner from the northern part of the state. He was 61 years old and had already buried 2 wives. The first wife had died of a sudden winter fever, but the servants whispered that the second wife had fallen down a great flight of stone stairs. Hazel had heard the story from Mary, who had heard it from a cousin working near the Baron's estate. Hazel had not slept properly for 3 nights since hearing those words. She had tried to speak to her uncle in his study 2 days ago, but he had simply looked out the window and told her that family debts had to be paid. Her family owed a great deal of money to Baron Kent, and Hazel was the price for clearing that ledger. She understood that her aunt and uncle had taken her in out of family duty, not out of love, and now they expected her to return the favor. She let the tears fall faster now onto her lap, because there was no one around to see her weakness. "I do not want to die in a strange house in the mountains," she whispered softly to herself. "I do not want to be the third wife who disappears. I would rather work as a maid in the town or sleep in an old barn than be sold to a man like that." The wind blew a single yellow leaf onto her lap, but she did not move to brush it away. On the other side of the tall green hedge, a man stood completely still on the grass. He had been standing there for several minutes, listening to the quiet sound of her grief. He had not intended to overhear her private thoughts, but he had taken the side path through the garden to avoid the front drive of the manor. He had stopped when he heard what he thought was a wounded animal, only to realize it was a woman speaking in a broken whisper. His name was Lawrence Winter, and the people of the valley spoke of him with a mixture of fear and respect. He was the master of the great stone estate on the highest peak, a man with stark white hair and skin as pale as marble, who rarely appeared in the town during the bright hours of the day. Lawrence was 32 years old, or at least he appeared to be to the few townspeople who saw him. In truth, he had watched the trees in this valley grow and fall for longer than anyone living could remember. He was a vampire king, the last of his line, living quietly in the cold hills of Vermont away from the crowded cities. He had come to Pinecrest Manor today on a matter of business regarding the debts of the Cross family. He had never seen the young woman behind the hedge before, but her low voice caught him. He stood in the shade of the pine trees, his dark coat absorbing the pale sunlight, his intense eyes fixed on the green leaves that separated them. He listened to her speak of being sold to Baron Kent, a man Lawrence knew to be cruel and greedy. Something moved in Lawrence's chest, a feeling he had not felt in many decades. He had spent a long time believing that the problems of ordinary people were none of his concern, but the raw honesty of her fear reached through his cold exterior. He closed his eyes and thought of his own long, solitary life in the mountains where no one ever spoke to him without wanting protection or money. He took one quiet step back from the hedge, his boots making no sound at all on the damp earth, and then he turned back toward the front of the house. Lawrence walked around the corner of the big house and approached the front door with steady steps. He pulled the iron bell, and the sound echoed through the quiet halls inside. The butler opened the door, took one look at Lawrence's white hair and pale skin, and quickly bowed his head. Lawrence handed the servant his card without speaking a word. The butler hurried down the hallway to the study, and within a minute, Mr. Cross came out to meet his visitor. The older man was thin and gray, with dark circles under his eyes and hands that shook slightly as he adjusted his coat. He welcomed Lawrence with too many polite words, moving aside to let the mysterious guest into his private workspace. The study smelled of old paper, cold tobacco, and the damp wool of coats that had not dried properly. A small fire burned in the hearth, throwing faint orange shadows across the shelves of books. Lawrence sat down in the wooden chair across from the desk and did not waste time with small talk. "I have purchased the debt you owe to Baron Raymond Kent," Lawrence said, his voice low and smooth like river stone. "The full amount was transferred to his bank 3 days ago." Mr. Cross froze, his hand stopping halfway to a stack of papers on his desk. He stared at Lawrence with wide eyes, his breath catching in his throat as he tried to understand the words. "I do not understand," Mr. Cross said, leaning forward. "Why would you buy my debt, Mr. Winter? We have never done business together." Lawrence looked at him steadily, his pale face showing no emotion at all. "You no longer owe any money to the Baron," Lawrence said clearly. "You owe it to me now, and I have decided to wipe the ledger clean. You do not have to pay me back a single dollar." Mr. Cross sank back into his chair, the color leaving his face until he looked almost as pale as the man sitting across from him. He kept shaking his head, looking down at his desk as if expecting to find a trick written on the wood. "There must be something you want in return," Mr. Cross whispered, his voice trembling. "A man does not give away a fortune for nothing." Lawrence leaned back slightly, keeping his hands resting flat on his knees. "I have only one request," he said. "It is not a condition for the debt, but I expect you to grant it, as a matter of decency. You have a niece living under this roof, Miss Hazel Cross. I understand she is currently engaged to marry Baron Kent in 3 weeks." Mr. Cross nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to guess what the wealthy stranger was leading to. "I want that engagement broken immediately," Lawrence said. His voice remained quiet, but there was a weight behind it that made the windows in the room rattle slightly in their frames. Mr. Cross swallowed hard and rubbed his temple. "My wife arranged that match," he said. "The Baron is a powerful man, and he will be furious if we break our word now." Lawrence did not blink. "The Baron will not trouble you," he said. "I have looked into his affairs, and he has other problems to worry about in the north. You will write the letter to him today, and you will tell him the wedding is off." The door to the study opened quietly, and Mrs. Cross walked into the room. She was a tall woman with sharp eyes and a tight mouth, wearing a heavy silk dress that rustled against the floor. She had been listening at the door, and her face was red with anger. "What right do you have to interfere in our family choices?" she demanded, standing beside her husband's chair. "Hazel is our responsibility, and the Baron offers her a secure life." Lawrence stood up from his chair, rising to his full height, his white hair catching the dim light from the fire. He looked down at the woman until she stepped back against the wall. "The Baron offers her a place in a graveyard. Lawrence said coldly. "I know what happened to his previous wives, and I think you know it too. You are willing to trade her safety to save your own pockets. I have already removed your debt, so you have no excuse left to send her away." Mrs. Cross looked at her husband, but the older man simply kept his eyes on the floor, refusing to look at her. Her mouth opened and closed, but she could find no words to answer the pale man who stood before them like a block of winter ice. "I will return to this valley in 3 days," Lawrence said, taking his black hat from the table. "By that time, I expect the letter to be sent to the Baron, and I expect Miss Cross to be told that she is free. If I find that you have lied to me, I will buy this house from the bank before the week is out, and you will find yourselves looking for a new place to sleep." He bowed to them with perfect manners, turned on his heel, and left the room. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, leaving the aunt and uncle alone in the quiet room. 3 days passed slowly at Pinecrest Manor, and Hazel knew nothing of the stranger who had visited the study. On the evening of the 3rd day, her aunt called her into the cold drawing-room where the lamps had not yet been lit. Mrs. Cross was sitting by the window, her fingers moving quickly over a piece of white lace she was sewing. She did not look up when Hazel entered the room. "The Baron has withdrawn his offer of marriage," her aunt said in a tight, flat voice that sounded as if she were swallowing vinegar. "You will not be going to the north. The wedding is cancelled." Hazel stood in the middle of the carpet and felt the room tilt slightly beneath her feet. She looked at her aunt's sharp profile against the gray window light, waiting for the rest of the sentence, but her aunt remained silent. "Why did he change his mind?" Hazel asked, her voice barely louder than a breath. "Did something happen to him?" Mrs. Cross snapped her thread with a sharp tug and finally looked at her niece. "It does not matter why," she said. "The matter is finished. You may return to your chores. There is no need for you to pack your things anymore." Hazel walked back to her small bedroom under the roof and sat on the edge of her narrow mattress. Her hands were shaking so hard she had to tuck them under her knees to make them stop. She felt a strange, dizzy sensation in her chest, a feeling of lightness that she had not known for 5 long years. She looked up at the dark wooden beams above her bed and wondered if her father had somehow heard her prayer in the garden. She did not sleep that night, instead watching the stars move across the square glass of her window until the sky turned pale blue. The next morning, Hazel went down to the kitchen early to help Mary with the baking. The room was warm and smelled of yeast and fresh wood smoke from the big oven. Mary was kneading dough on the long wooden table, her arms white with flour up to her elbows. She looked up when Hazel entered and gave her a small, knowing nod. "I see you look a bit brighter today," the old cook said, leaning over the table. "The house feels different this morning, doesn't it?" Hazel sat down on a stool and began to peel apples for the pies. "Do you know what happened, Mary?" Hazel asked quietly, keeping her eyes on the red skin of the fruit. "My aunt told me the wedding is off, but she would not tell me why." Mary stopped her work and wiped her hands on her apron, looking toward the door to make sure no one was listening. "A visitor came to see your uncle 3 days ago," the cook whispered. "A very rich gentleman from the high estate up north. The footman told me the man had hair as white as snow and skin like clear marble. He stayed in the study for half an hour, and after he left, your aunt went straight to her room and cried." "A man with white hair?" Hazel asked, holding the knife still against the apple. "Who is he?" Mary shook her head and turned back to her dough. "His name is Lawrence Winter," she said. "People say he owns most of the timberlands in the valley, but he keeps to himself. He never comes to the town picnics, and he doesn't use a carriage like the others. He just rides a dark horse through the trees after dusk. I don't know why he cared about your wedding, child, but he's the one who made your uncle write that letter to the Baron." Hazel spent the rest of the morning in a daze, her mind turning the cook's words over and over. She could not think of any reason why a wealthy stranger from the mountains would help her. That afternoon, when her chores were finished, she took her woolen shawl and walked out into the garden. The air was cool and crisp, and the sky was clear from one horizon to the other. She walked down the gravel path, past the dead roses, and stepped behind the tall hedge to her secret stone bench. She sat down and looked up at the white buds starting to show on the apple tree. She did not hear any footsteps on the gravel, but a sudden shadow fell across the grass near her feet. She looked up quickly, her breath catching in her throat, as she saw a man standing at the corner of the hedge. He was very tall, wearing a long, dark coat that reached past his knees. His hair was completely white, falling softly over his forehead, and his skin was so pale it seemed to glow slightly in the shade of the trees. His eyes were a deep, quiet gray, like the sky before a heavy winter storm. He stood still, waiting for her to speak. Hazel stood up from the stone bench so quickly that her shawl slipped from her shoulders and fell to the grass. She dropped a small curtsy because her mother had taught her always to show respect to gentlemen, even when her heart was beating like a caught bird. "I am sorry if I am trespassing," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I did not know anyone else was in the garden." The white-haired man did not move closer, keeping a careful distance between them as if he did not want to frighten her. "You are not trespassing, Miss Cross," he said, and his voice was low and calm, filling the quiet space behind the hedge. "This is your garden, and I am the one who has entered without an invitation. My name is Lawrence Winter. I came to the house to speak with your uncle, but the maid told me I might find you out here." Hazel looked at his pale hands, which were steady and relaxed by his sides. "You are the man who spoke to my uncle about the Baron," she said directly. "Mary told me you came." Lawrence nodded once, his gray eyes watching her face with a quiet intensity. "I asked your uncle to break the engagement," he said simply. "He agreed to do so." Hazel took a step forward, her curiosity overcoming her fear for a brief moment. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You do not know me, and you owe nothing to my family. A man of your position does not usually care about the troubles of a poor niece in a gray dress." Lawrence looked up at the bare branches of the apple tree above them. "I was walking through this garden 3 days ago," he said after a short silence. "I took the path on the other side of this very hedge because I wanted to avoid the main driveway. I heard someone crying, and I stopped because I thought an animal was hurt. I stayed there, and I heard what you said to the empty air. I heard you say that you would rather die in a ditch than be sold to Baron Kent." Hazel felt a hot wave of red climb up her neck and into her cheeks, and she looked down at her shoes in shame. "You had no right to listen to my private thoughts," she whispered, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt. Lawrence looked back at her, his expression softening just enough for her to notice. "You are right," he said. "I should have walked away immediately, and I apologize for taking your words without your knowledge. But after I heard them, I could not simply go home to my mountains and pretend the world was fair. I knew the Baron's reputation, and I knew what would happen to you if you went to his estate. I went to your uncle and bought the debts your father left behind," Lawrence continued, his tone remaining level and calm. "I told him the money was forgiven, so he no longer had a reason to sell your future to the north. I did not tell him what I heard you say behind the hedge. That secret belongs to you, and I will never share it with anyone else in this valley." Hazel looked up at him, her eyes wide as she tried to find any sign of a trick in his gray gaze. "You gave away your own money just to save a stranger?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. "Nobody does that. Not in this town, and certainly not for me." Lawrence took one slow step forward, but stopped before he reached the edge of her grass patch. "I am not like the other men in this town, Miss Cross," he said quietly. "I have more wealth than I can ever spend, and I have lived long enough to know that some things are worth more than gold. You should not have to pay for your father's mistakes with your life. There is one more thing," Lawrence added, reaching into his coat pocket to pull out a small piece of folded paper. "I have spoken with a lawyer in the village this morning. I have set up a small legal income in your name, using money from my own accounts. It is not a fortune, but it is enough to pay for your food and clothes if you ever choose to leave this house. Your uncle cannot touch it, and your aunt cannot take it away. It belongs to you tomorrow, whether you stay in Silveridge or go somewhere else." Hazel looked at the small piece of paper in Lawrence's pale hand, but she did not reach out to take it. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps as she tried to understand the weight of what he was offering. "You are giving me a life," she whispered, her hands dropping back to her sides. "I do not know how to receive something so large from a man I met only 5 minutes ago. It feels like a debt, Mr. Winter, even if you say it is not. I have nothing to give you in return for this kindness." "You do not need to give me anything," Lawrence said, his white hair moving slightly in the mountain breeze. "It is not a trade, and it is not a loan. I do not want your gratitude, and I do not want your service. I only want you to know that you are safe now, and that no one can buy your future again while I am alive in these hills." He walked over to the low stone wall at the edge of the path and set the paper down on the cold rock, placing a small gray stone on top to keep it from blowing away. "I will leave you now, Miss Cross," Lawrence said, turning back toward the main path. "I have done what I came to do, and I will not trouble you with my presence anymore if it makes you uncomfortable." Hazel looked from the paper on the wall back to his tall figure as he began to walk away. "Wait," she called out before she could stop herself. "Please, do not go just yet." Lawrence stopped at the corner of the hedge and turned his head to look back at her over his shoulder. "I do not wish for you to stay hidden in your mountains," Hazel said, her voice growing stronger as she took a step toward the path. "You have done the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me in 5 years, and it would be a very poor thing if I never spoke to you again. If you are willing, Mr. Winter, I would like to know the man who saved me from the Baron." Lawrence stood still for a long moment, his face silhouetted against the bright afternoon sky. "If that is what you want, Miss Cross, I will return next week," he said quietly. "I will call on your aunt and ask permission to walk with you in the open parts of the garden. Your aunt will not refuse me because she is afraid of my family's name, but I will only come if you tell me now that you truly want it." Hazel looked at his gray eyes and felt a strange sense of peace that she had never felt around her relatives. "I want you to come," she said clearly. By the end of the week, the legal papers had been signed by her uncle, and Hazel held the small wooden box containing her new security under her bed. Her aunt did not speak to her for 2 whole days, and her cousin Lydia looked at her with narrow eyes during breakfast, but Hazel did not care about their silence anymore. She spent her afternoons walking along the stone paths, looking up at the high peaks where Lawrence lived, wondering what kind of life he led in his dark stone house among the pines. When Lawrence returned the following Thursday, the aunt received him in the front room with a stiff, formal curtsy and a cup of tea that he politely accepted but did not drink. He asked if he might walk with Miss Cross in the afternoon air, and Mrs. Cross gave a tight nod without looking at either of them. They walked along the front gravel paths where the great windows of the manor could see them, because Lawrence seemed to know, without being told, that Hazel did not want her secret hedge made part of this new acquaintance. They did not say many words during that first hour together. Lawrence asked her if her room was warm enough for the coming autumn, and she told him that Mary gave her extra blankets from the kitchen chests. He told her about the mountain trails behind his estate, where the deer came down to drink from the cold streams before the ice set in. His speech was simple and direct, containing none of the double meanings or hidden sharp edges that Hazel had grown used to in her aunt's conversation. She felt she could rest in his words. By the 5th week of his visits, the pale sun of autumn had turned the leaves of the Vermont woods into deep reds and dull golds. Lawrence came every Thursday afternoon, always arriving on his dark horse, just as the shadows began to lengthen across the valley floor. They had begun to talk more during their long walks around the grounds of the manor. Hazel told him about her father's small house near the coast, where they had lived before the money ran out, and how he used to read her old stories about the sea while the winter storms rattled the glass. Lawrence listened to her without interrupting, his white hair catching the pale light of the late afternoon as they moved between the rows of dark pine trees. When she finished speaking about her past, she looked at his side profile, noting the sharp, clean line of his jaw and the strange stillness of his frame. "You never speak of your own family, Mr. Winter," she said softly. "Mary told me your people have lived in the High Valley for more than 100 years, but no one seems to know where you came from before that." "My family came from across the ocean a very long time ago," Lawrence said, keeping his eyes on the mountain peaks above them. "We chose these mountains because the air is cold and the trees are thick enough to keep the world away. I live alone now because the others have passed into the earth or moved on to deeper woods. It is a quiet life, Miss Cross, and most people find it too cold to bear for very long." He did not smile, but his voice had a gentle tone that made her feel safe. "I do not think coldness is the worst thing in the world," Hazel said, looking down at her boots as they crunched against the dry leaves. "Cruelty is much worse, and so is darkness that hides behind polite words. I lived in a warm house with my aunt and uncle, but I was colder there than I am out here with you in the wind." Lawrence stopped walking and turned to face her, his gray eyes darkening slightly as he reached out and picked up a fallen red leaf from her sleeve. That afternoon, after Lawrence had ridden back up the mountain trail, Hazel went into the kitchen to help Mary wash the heavy pewter plates from the midday meal. The old cook was sitting by the fire, her feet resting on a low stool, a cup of herbal tea steaming in her lap. She looked up at Hazel with a soft expression in her old eyes. "I saw you walking with the Master of the Peaks today," Mary said. "He looks like a winter spirit, he does. But the people in the village are singing his praises this morning." "Why are they singing his praises?" Hazel asked, taking a dry cloth and beginning to wipe the water from a large bowl. Mary leaned forward, lowering her voice so the sound would not carry up the back stairs. "My sister's husband works the timber lot near the river," she whispered. "He told me Mr. Winter's agent came by yesterday and tore up the rent books for 3 of the old families whose crops failed in the early frost. He told them they could keep their cabins for the winter without paying a single penny, and he told them not to tell anyone who did it. He does not want people to thank him," Hazel said, remembering how Lawrence had treated her own situation. Mary nodded her head, her gray curls moving against her white cap. "He does things because they need doing, child, not because he wants a crowd to cheer his name. Some folks in the tavern say he's a monster who lives in the dark, but I told my sister that a monster doesn't fix a leaking roof for an old widow or save a young girl from a cruel baron in the north." Hazel thought about those words for the rest of the night, while she lay in her small room under the rafters. She realized that Lawrence carried a deep kindness inside his cold chest, hiding it from the world behind his pale face and his silent manners. When he returned the following week, she did not mention the rent books or the old families in the valley because she wanted to respect his secrets. But when he stood by his horse at the end of the hour and bowed to her, she looked directly into his gray eyes. "Good afternoon, Lawrence," she said, using his name for the very first time. He stopped, his hand freezing on the leather reins, and looked at her for a long moment before he gave her a small, true nod. "Good afternoon, Hazel," he replied. The late November wind brought the first real snow to Silveridge, covering the mountain slopes in a thick blanket of white that matched Lawrence's hair. The household at Pinecrest Manor had turned its full attention away from Hazel because her cousin Lydia had just become engaged to a wealthy lawyer from the village. The rooms were filled with the sound of dressmakers cutting bright silks, and her aunt shouting orders to the kitchen maids about the menu for the engagement dinner. Hazel was left almost entirely alone for the first time in 5 years, and she found that she thoroughly enjoyed the peace. She spent her mornings reading old history books she found on the bottom shelves of her uncle's library, and her afternoons walking through the snowy paths with a heavy woolen coat Mary had helped her mend. One Thursday afternoon, a messenger arrived from the village with a small newspaper containing news from the northern towns. Hazel read the notice at the kitchen table while the tea was brewing. Baron Raymond Kent had died suddenly at his estate from a severe lung fever that had taken him in less than 2 days. She set the paper down on the wooden table and looked out the window at the falling white flakes. She did not feel any sadness for the man she had never met, but she felt a great, quiet space open up in her chest. The threat that had hung over her life for so long was completely gone now, dissolved into the cold ground of the north. She knew that even if Lawrence had not stepped in to buy the debt, the Baron would never have come to claim her. She felt a deep gratitude for the pale man who had given her her freedom before the winter could take it. Lawrence came to the manor that afternoon, despite the snow that was beginning to drift across the gravel drives. He did not mention the Baron's death at all when they met in the front hall, and Hazel understood that his silence was a matter of respect for her feelings. They walked out into the garden anyway, their boots leaving twin sets of tracks in the fresh white powder. He was carrying a small rectangular package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a bit of rough twine, which he handed to her when they reached the shelter of the pine trees. "Open it when you are warm inside," Lawrence said, his breath showing as a faint white mist in the cold air. Hazel could not wait, her fingers working quickly at the twine until the paper fell away to reveal a small book bound in dark green leather. It was a collection of poems by an old writer she had mentioned wanting to read during their very first walk around the grounds. "You remembered," she said, her voice full of surprise as she pressed the cool leather against her coat. "I remember everything you tell me, Hazel," Lawrence said simply, his gray eyes watching the snow settle on her woolen hood. "I had my agent find it in a shop across the border last week. I hoped it would give you something to do while the winter keeps you inside these walls." Hazel looked up at his pale face, noticing how the white flakes seemed to disappear into his skin without melting right away. "You are the only person who listens to me, Lawrence," she said softly. They walked toward the back of the grounds until they stood before the tall hedge that led to her secret bench. The apple tree was completely bare now, its dark branches catching the white snow until they looked like silver bones against the gray sky. Hazel stopped by the stone wall and looked at him. "I know I can live without you now, Lawrence," she said clearly. "The income you gave me is safe under my bed, and I could take a room in the village tomorrow if I wanted to leave my aunt's house. I want you to know that before I say anything else." Lawrence stood very still, his dark coat dusted with white, his pale hands resting against his sides. "Why do you tell me this now, Hazel?" he asked quietly. "Because I want you to know that I am choosing to be here," she said, taking a step closer to him until she could feel the coldness radiating from his frame. "I am not staying with you because I am afraid, or because I have nowhere else to go. I am staying because I want to see you every week, and because my life is better when you are standing in it." Lawrence looked at her for a long time, his intense gaze softening until his eyes looked like the warm gray of a spring morning. "May I take your hand?" he asked, and when she nodded, his cold fingers closed gently around hers. The spring came late to the mountains of Vermont, but when it arrived, the snow melted quickly into the rushing creeks and left the valley green and fresh. Hazel and Lawrence were married in the middle of May in a small stone chapel that sat on the edge of his high mountain estate. The windows of the chapel were made of old glass that threw pale blues and soft yellows across the stone floor when the morning sun came over the peaks. Hazel wore a simple dress the color of fresh cream, which she had purchased herself from a seamstress in the village, using the money from her own small income. Her aunt had refused to come to the wedding, staying at Pinecrest Manor to complain about her headaches, but her uncle and her cousin Lydia sat quietly in the middle pews. Mary the cook sat in the very front row, wearing her best dark wool dress and a clean white cap, her old eyes shining with tears that she kept brushing away with a handkerchief. At the back of the stone chapel, an old man with rough hands and a patched coat sat quietly by the door, watching the ceremony with a serious face. It was the old farmer whose rent Lawrence had forgiven during the autumn frost, and Hazel had quietly sent him an invitation through Mary's sister. When the ceremony was finished, and they walked down the stone steps into the bright spring air, Lawrence paused and looked down at his new wife with a questioning look in his eyes. "I saw old Thomas sitting by the door," Lawrence said, his white hair moving in the mountain breeze. "I did not know you knew him. The cook told me what you did for his family last winter," Hazel said, holding his cold hand tightly against her cream skirt. "I knew you did not want anyone to make a fuss, so I did not say anything until today. But I wanted him to be here, to see that his landlord is a happy man." Lawrence looked back toward the chapel doors, and then down at her face, a small movement at the corner of his mouth showing the nearest thing to a smile she had ever seen on him. "You are a very observant woman, Hazel," Lawrence said softly, his gray eyes reflecting the green of the new leaves on the trees. "I thought I had hidden my tracks well enough from the town." "You cannot hide your kindness from me, Lawrence," she replied, turning to face him fully on the stone steps. "I spent 5 years watching people hide their selfishness behind beautiful words, so it is very easy for me to see when a man hides his goodness behind a cold face." They walked down the rest of the steps together, to where the carriage was waiting to take them to the big stone house at the top of the ridge. Mary came down to meet them, taking Hazel's hands in her own rough ones and pressing them warmly. "You look beautiful, child," the old cook said. "Your father would be a proud man today if he could see you standing here in the sunshine." Hazel kissed the old woman's cheek and thanked her for the secret behind the hedge that had brought them all together. The great stone house on the mountain became Hazel's home that afternoon, and she found that it was not cold at all inside its thick walls. The rooms were large and quiet, filled with old books and heavy wooden furniture that had been polished until it shone in the lamplight. The housekeeper, a serious woman named Mrs. Miller, welcomed her with a respectful bow and showed her the keys to the linen chests and the pantries. Hazel felt a deep sense of ownership as she walked through the halls, knowing she was no longer a poor cousin living on charity. A full year passed like a quiet river flowing through the green valleys of Vermont. Hazel had settled completely into her new life as the mistress of the high estate, learning the names of all the families who lived on Lawrence's lands and making sure their roofs were tight before the winter storms returned. She spent her mornings working with Mrs. Miller in the great kitchens, organizing the stores for the seasons, and her afternoons planting young apple trees in the sunny orchard behind the main stables. She had not cried behind any hedges for 12 months, because there was no longer any grief inside her to hide from the world. Her aunt and uncle had moved away to a smaller house near the coast after Lydia's wedding, and Pinecrest Manor had been sold to a timber merchant from the city. But Hazel rarely thought about the gray rooms of her old life. She had found a new kind of peace in the mountain house, where the clocks moved slowly and the nights were long and silent. One evening in the late spring, almost exactly 1 year after their wedding day, Hazel was sitting in the large library with Lawrence. A small fire burned quietly in the stone hearth, filling the room with the warm smell of birch logs and old paper. The great windows were open a few inches to let in the night air, which brought the scent of damp earth and the first white blossoms from her young orchard outside. Hazel was reading the same book of green leather poems he had given her in the snow. Lawrence was sitting at his large walnut desk near the window, writing a letter to his land agent about the summer timber clearing. His white hair caught the yellow glow of the oil lamp beside his paper, and his pale skin looked smooth and calm in the twilight. He set his black pen down on the brass stand and turned his chair around to look at her across the quiet room. "You have been very quiet tonight, Hazel," he said, his low voice carrying softly over the sound of the fire. "I was just thinking about the garden at Pinecrest Manor," Hazel said, closing her green book and resting it on her lap. "I was remembering the afternoon when you first came around the corner of the hedge and found me sitting on that cold stone bench. It seems like it happened to a different woman in a different town, Lawrence. I can barely remember the weight of that gray dress I used to wear every day." Lawrence rose from his desk and walked across the oriental rug to her chair, his movements completely silent and full of an effortless grace that she had grown to love. He knelt down beside her seat, resting his pale hands on the carved wooden arm of her chair, his gray eyes looking up into her face with a steady, quiet devotion. "I remember that day every time I see the sun go down behind the pines," he said, his voice dropping into a lower register. "I had lived in these mountains for longer than this town has been on the map, Hazel," Lawrence whispered, his cold fingers reaching out to touch the edge of her sleeve. "I thought my heart had turned to stone a century ago, and I believed that my life would always be just a long, silent watch over these empty trees. But when I heard you crying behind that green wall, something broke inside me that had been frozen for a very long time. I needed you to save me from my own darkness, just as much as you needed me to save you from the Baron," he continued, leaning his forehead gently against her knee. "You brought the spring back into this old house, Hazel, and you taught a monster how to live in the light again." Hazel put her warm hand over his white hair, her fingers moving through the soft strands as the fire burned down to red coals in the hearth. The pale light of the stars shone through the open library window, throwing long, thin shadows across the wooden floorboards and the dark leather of the books on the shelves. Hazel looked out into the quiet night, listening to the small sounds of the mountain forest, the rustle of pine needles in the wind, the distant call of an owl from the high ridge, and the steady, calm breathing of the man beside her. She felt the cool air against her face and knew that the long winter of her life had finally come to an end, leaving behind a soil that was rich and ready for whatever the future might bring to their valley. She thought about the years that lay ahead of them, knowing that Lawrence's life would stretch far beyond the normal span of the people in the village below. It was a strange and mysterious path they had chosen together, one that did not match the stories she had read as a child or the rules her aunt had tried to teach her in the drawing room. Yet as she watched the small white petals of the apple blossoms drift past the window glass in the dark, she knew that true security did not come from matching the patterns of the world, but from finding a single soul who would listen to your tears behind a hidden wall. They would face the passing of the seasons in this high house, watching the green leaves turn to gold and the gold turn to snow, year after year, while the town below changed its names and its roads. There would be challenges in the dark hours, and secrets they would always have to keep from the strangers who came up the mountain path. But she felt no fear of the shadows anymore, because she knew the heart that ruled them. She leaned down and pressed her forehead against Lawrence's cool brow, letting her hand rest flat against his cheek as the last candle guttered out, leaving them together in the quiet, healing dark of the spring night.